Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers, brought to you by the Foundation for Economic Education. So what's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
Well, this week there was some disturbing news on the cryptocurrency front. A bug in digital wallets designed by Parity Technologies resulted in the loss, get this, of $300 million in the cryptocurrency Ethereum. I'd underline that the debacle is not due to Ethereum, but to certain digital wallets that some people use to store Ethereum. The problem began with a bug in Parity Technologies software that allowed hackers to steal $32 million of Ethereum from digital wallets. In fixing the bug, one of Parity's developers created a second bug that would have allowed a single person to steal ownership of all of Parity's digital wallets. Upon realizing the error, the developer attempted to undo the damage by deleting the code that created this second bug. Problem solved. Not quite. In deleting the code, the developer actually ended up locking all the affected wallets and throwing away the key. The bottom line is that there is now $300 million worth of cryptocurrency sitting in wallets to which no one has or ever will have the key.
That's probably going to cause some problems down the road.
Yeah, there's some very unhappy people right now. And I underline, this is not a problem with the cryptocurrency, but rather a predictable side effect of the cryptocurrency's youth. As cryptocurrencies become more popular, digital wallet companies like Parity Technologies will compete for business by offering third-party insurance on deposits, similar to how banks do. In other news, NASA and Uber inked a deal to develop traffic systems for flying cars named Uber Air. Uber Air wants vehicles that will take off and land vertically and fly at low altitude. Where Uber is concerned, this is great news. Uber radically transformed personal ground transportation by competing with taxis. Hopefully it can do something similar as it turns its sights on air transportation. Where NASA is concerned, however, this deal appears less interesting. 50 years ago, NASA took humans to the moon, 240,000 miles above Earth's surface. NASA then replaced the lunar program with the space shuttle that took humans into orbit, 250 miles above Earth's surface. Now NASA has partnered with Uber to lift humans into low altitude, which is about 500 feet above Earth's surface. At this rate, one can expect NASA's next partnership to involve trampolines.
I'm going to bring us back down to Earth travel and talk about the TSA for a minute, because this week the TSA, it was reported, failed yet another round of tests, undercover tests, as it were. The TSA had about an 80% failure this time around. Now, Ant, we spend about $7 billion on this mess of an organization every year, and all we get for the money is more abuse and more failure, year over year over year. But I guess we could look at the bright side, right? Last time the TSA had undercover testing, there was a 95% failure rate. So things are improving. Where the next?
Yeah, TSA has quadrupled its performance.
Yeah, that's right. We're keeping the world safe from 3 ounces of liquid at a time for 15 years now. And I guess we'll just have to see where it all goes next. Even closer to Earth, this actually kind of warmed my heart because President Barack Obama, I do miss him. I never thought I would say such a thing. But President Obama got jury duty last week and actually showed up, unlike the rest of us who would have found reason after reason after reason not to go. Barack Obama showed up, signed some autographs, wasn't picked for duty, and was sent on his way. But nice to see that even former presidents have to put up with this sort of thing. And in the foolishness of the week, we're back to the outrage industry. We've got another gaggle of offended students, this time from Indiana University, where a Thomas Hart Benton painting has aroused the usual sort of outrage because it depicts Klansmen in robes. And students, of course, are demanding that it be taken down. The people at Indiana University say that it can't be taken down without damaging it. But what the students don't know or probably don't care about is that the painting depicts these Klansmen alongside a reporter and a photographer, people who uncovered the Klan's ties to government in Indiana and broke its political influence over the state. So it's really a celebration of the Klan's losing its political authority in the state, and yet the students are all outraged and want the whole thing removed. So I don't even know what to say about this anymore. Everybody's outraged all the time.
Realizing that would require stopping and thinking about what they're looking at.
Yeah, right, or getting some sort of historical perspective on the nature of their own outrage, but, they feel, therefore they are. And I think that's about where we are almost everywhere these days. Be that as it may, we've got something perhaps a little more important to talk about, a surprising thing maybe for us. The World Fair Trade Organization has declared this week World Fair Trade Week, and will be having its 14th annual conference in New Delhi in celebration of this. So, what is the World Fair Trade Organization, and what is fair trade? These are pretty good questions to begin with, things that people don't often think about, but probably bear some consideration.
The World Fair Trade Organization is a global network of organizations representing what's called the fair trade supply line. Generally speaking, the goal of fair trade is to improve living conditions of farmers and workers in developing countries and to help promote environmental protections.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting that you would add the environmental protections part because their conference is called Fair Trade, A Path to Sustainable Development. So there's a lot of buzzwords here that need to be unpacked, but right off the top, I think we could stipulate that everybody's in favor of better conditions for human beings.
I think that's true. That's something we can agree on. We can also agree that most everybody's interested in protecting the environment. The term sustainability bugs me to no end, largely because there's no definition. In fact, if you go to World Organization that promotes sustainability and you click on About, one of the first things they'll tell you is there's no universally agreed definition on what sustainability means. And yet these are the same organizations that are promoting this undefined sustainability.
Right, so I guess nothing new there in the scope of human activity. But, maybe we can take a step back, leave that one off to the side, ridicule it later if we see fit, and really think about fair trade, because that one there seems to be at least some working definition we can stipulate and move forward. So what is fair trade, and when did this movement begin? What are we really talking about here?
The fair trade movement actually has its roots in the 1940s, when a group called 10,000 Villages began buying handcraft products produced initially in Puerto Rico and then selling them in the U.S. And you can still see the remains of this in some churches will have these fairs where people will come in who have brought products that were made in developing countries, and they'll sell them there and send the money back as a means of promoting small local business in these developing countries. In the 1970s, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and individuals established what we now know as fair trade organizations. Their purpose was to provide advice and support to producers in developing countries. And then finally, in the late 1980s, we got the establishment of what we now know as fair trade labeling. It was instituted to identify products that adhered to what they considered to be fair trade standards.
All right, so that's actually pretty interesting. So we've got some form of certification here for approved forms of trade, right? So who awards the certifications, right? I guess I'm asking in the end, who gets to decide which trade is fair, and then by what standards?
It turns out to be a voluntary association. There's not much government footprint on any of this, either at the national or the UN level. People have organized these voluntary associations, some of the large ones, Fair Trade International, Fair for Life, Fair Trade UN, say, and there's basically associations of people up and down the supply chain who agree to adhere to whatever standards the organization puts in place, and the standards are intended to help promote business in these developing countries to get more wages and more protections to workers in these developing countries. But the interesting thing is it's largely voluntary.
It's largely voluntary, and it's almost entirely agricultural in nature, right? We're not talking about all kinds of different trade. We're really talking about a subset of global trade, and it's almost all agricultural, isn't it?
It's not only all agricultural, but even there, it's mostly coffee. Coffee comprises 50% of fair trade, tea another 20%. The remaining 30% is divided amongst cocoa, seed, cotton, cane, sugar, bananas, nuts, miscellaneous fruits, and flowers. So largely speaking, it's coffee, followed by other agricultural stuff.
Right, and I think most of us experience this in terms of coffee, right? When we're walking around, see the sign at the coffee shop, Fair Trade Approved or Fair Trade Coffee, this sort of thing. And that's, I think, the only place I've ever actually seen it, but I don't spend a lot of my time in grocery markets. So, I wouldn't have seen any of these other things.
That's true. It seems to parallel the rise of Starbucks. So Starbucks touted itself as being, more environmentally friendly, pushed itself toward people who are more interested in social issues. And so fair trade seems to have grown in popularity along with Starbucks, who happens to sell coffee.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And somebody remarked on the Words and Numbers Facebook page just this week, which everybody should go join, by the way. He remarked that Starbucks is in the business of selling image, not coffee, and that this would dovetail quite nicely with that. But, I don't want to dismiss it out of hand because it makes people feel good. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to try to do, especially when you're in the business of selling things.
Sure.
But the interesting bit here is that even though this is a small subset of agricultural products, as you peel it away, what it seems to do is set a price floor.
Yes, that's one of the major things.
So why would people want to do that? What's the net effect of setting price floors on these sorts of commodities?
The intent is, and again, looking at coffee, which comprises the lion's share of fair trade, coffee prices fluctuate wildly on world markets. So one of the goals of the Fair Trade Organization is to establish a price floor, but a price floor that isn't higher necessarily than the average price of coffee, but is higher than the low point as the price fluctuates. So it provides kind of like a lower barrier below which the price won't fall. It's kind of interesting in that sense, but it's also somewhat duplicative in that futures markets do the same sort of thing. In fact, futures markets evolved as a means for farmers to protect their downside risk to price fluctuations. Now, of course, the problem here is farmers in developing nations don't have access to financial markets the way farmers in developed countries do.
So in no small part, this is an attempt, if I'm hearing you correctly, to smooth out the rough edges of the farmer's life, right? It allows them to plan for their future, knowing about what their products are going to fetch on an open market, minus the vagaries of open markets, both high and low.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a price floor in the sense that a minimum wage might be, for example, or other sorts of price controls. It seems to be simply a matter of smoothing out those severe dips.
Right. In that respect, it's probably quite a boon to any number of people involved in these markets.
Right. That's correct.
So I guess the next question I've got then is what makes these kind of products special? Is there something about the life of a farmer that's just simply different from the lives of people who produce other things for other markets?
From an economic perspective, there is, and that's what in this country gave rise to the development of things like futures and options contracts. It was specifically the fact that you have farmers who have to invest in seed and planting 6 months to a year before they know what price they're going to be able to sell their product at. So the futures and options markets arose as a means to sell that risk off to other people, get it off the backs of the farmers. So fair trade in part does that, but it comes at a price. One of the things that you have to agree to be in the fair trade supply chain is that you agree to pay a premium to the cooperative organization that's in addition to the sale price, and that's about 20 cents per pound of coffee currently.
So it's actually a relatively negligible amount when it comes right down to it.
Yeah, it causes the price of coffee to be higher. There's an interesting study that estimated the price of coffee is about 130% higher to farmers who belong to fair trade organizations versus those that don't. So like anything else, it comes at a cost because the risk that you're trying to get rid of these price fluctuations, you can't just make it disappear. You've got to send it somewhere, and that's a costly proposition.
Right, it's costly for the farmers involved, but it's not terribly costly for the end user, right? If you're going to go to Starbucks and pay for a single cup of coffee, 20 cents a pound is nothing. Now, that's probably going to be a very meaningful premium to the first guy who resells the pound.
That's right. That's correct.
So that kind of leads into the next kind of question that I've got, which, I don't know if you can answer it. I don't know if you have the special knowledge that it would take, but you said earlier that all of this is voluntary, which makes it a real happy occurrence where I come from. I really like voluntary interactions. As the nice people at FEE say, anything peaceful. And what could be more peaceful than voluntary interactions? But I'm wondering if, even though it's voluntary to opt in, do cartels emerge from this? Because this would seem to be the kind of thing that on the supply side could yield all kinds of unintended consequences.
It certainly could. Depending on how it plays out, it could certainly become the equivalent of a cartel. And you see just a hint of that with coffee. One of the studies that was done in looking at coffee producers in a state in Mexico were comparing fair trade coffee producers to conventional coffee producers. And what they found, this is the study that found that the fair trade producers were getting 130% more on the price of coffee. However, when they looked at those producers' workers, the workers were only earning about 7% more than the workers in the conventional coffee firms. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag as you get further down the level to the actual person who's out in the field picking whatever the crop is.
Does that offer us a bottom line perspective? Is there anything more that we really should know about what the net result of the fair trade movement is? Or is that about it?
I think the important thing here is for fair trade not to become a cartel is going to require competition. And it seems that there's a bit of that now, really now. So as long as you have multiple fair trade organizations, if one of them develops into a cartel that is in effect really not helping the workers, but simply using its fair trade status, its certification to shut out smaller farmers from competing, if that's the case, so long as consumers can become aware of that and they have an option. So they say, okay, I'm no longer buying fair trade coffee with the ABC brand label on it. I'm going to buy with the XYZ label on it. So the consumers then have the ability to shift their flow of funds away from the cartel toward the organization that's actually promoting what we understand to be fair trade. So that's one thing that's necessary. The other thing that's necessary is to keep the governments out of it, which it appears so far there's not a lot of government action here. As soon as governments start becoming involved and the thing becomes no longer voluntary, now you have a problem where there's a direct profit for the larger producers, the larger farmers, to co-opt the government to shut out smaller competition.
All right, so the curiosity here is that often fair trade and free trade are juxtaposed. They're not the same thing, that free trade is by definition not fair, and so on and so forth. But as you've explained it, and as I understand it, it seems that this version of fair trade is just an outgrowth of free trade, right? It is people doing what they want to do in markets without interference on the part of governments. So this is actually a sort of free trade that we're seeing here in the fair trade movement.
Yeah, thus far, it looks very much like free trade with this extra thing tied onto it that you're not just buying a cup of coffee, you're actually helping people who need help. So it's kind of a combination of trade/charity. But so long as it remains voluntary, it has all the attributes of free trade, and most of the benefits that come from free trade also apply here, with one possible exception. And this is where fair trade becomes interesting from an economic perspective. It is possible that a country does not have a comparative advantage in the product that has the fair trade labeling. For example, it might be possible that a country actually has a comparative advantage in the production of cocoa, but it may be possible that cocoa in this country just doesn't resonate with people interested in fair trade, and so consequently, coffee, which is not their comparative advantage, gets the fair trade label, and now people in developed countries are buying this country's coffee. What's the problem, you might ask? Well, the problem is we're now encouraging the country to divert its resources into the production of a good in which it doesn't have a comparative advantage. If you want an analogy, it's like taking someone who's a talented accountant and out of work and saying, here, stop looking for a job in accounting, come fix my car. And yes, the guy is employed and he's fixing cars, but he's not that. All you've done is you've encouraged him to spend time that could have been devoted to developing and marketing the thing that he's good at, and take that time away and have him expend it on something he's actually not quite good at. That's fine as long as your charity continues. But the minute you decide you no longer like this guy fixing your car, he's out of work.
Right, but, as these things go, it's just another wrinkle in the free market that has to be accounted for by participants in the market.
Yeah, and I think that's right. As long as the whole thing is voluntary, all this stuff, and there are going to be messy errors that occur, but they all have the tendency to iron out, to get cleared out over time.
So surprisingly, it seems we're of a mind that fair trade is really non-problematic. So I'll give you the last word, and you can wrap this up any way you like.
Well, I think economists of all stripes agree that trade is a positive-sum phenomenon wherein both parties become better off. This benefit comes from two sources. One is that parties specialize in producing the things that they're better at producing, and the other is that they exchange those things for things that they aren't good at producing. Trade isn't something we have to encourage. The benefits are so great that all we need to do is not discourage it. And where fair trade is concerned, this is both the good and the bad news. To the extent that fair trade encourages consumers and producers to do things they would have done anyway had they been aware of and had access to market opportunities, then fair trade is beneficial. But to the extent that fair trade restricts consumers and producers from transacting business unless they do so on terms dictated by fair trade consortiums, then fair trade has the possibility of being harmful. And perhaps the most positive thing to come from the fair trade movement is that it's brought people who might otherwise be skeptical of markets to an appreciation of how free markets can raise people out of poverty.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week, Wednesday, at about noon Eastern Time for another episode. Until then, check out all the great content at fee.org and at Fee Online, and join us for an ongoing conversation at the Words and Numbers Backstage Facebook group. Till next weekend, I'll catch you later.
See you next week, James.